Hey guys, it's On Education. I'm Dan Martin, your humble host, and today we are going to be talking about actual ideas that you can bring into your classroom to help increase the critical thinking skills of your students. In the last podcast, we talked about critical thinking theory more, and we described the process of critical thinking, the traits of a critical thinker, the stages of developing critical thinking. And we presented some ideas on how to incorporate this into the classroom, but this podcast is going to be more of a practical one where I'm going to present some actual ideas on activities and things that you can do in your classroom to increase this important skill. Before we do this, let's take a little bit of a step back and review what we talked about in the last podcast. In the last podcast, we presented some ideas by Dr. Paul, and he is a Critical Thinking Skills Institute member of the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, and he has written extensively about this subject. He's written several articles and books about critical thinking, and this was a interview for a quarterly newsletter of Lifelong Learning Network in fall of 1998. And so how does he define critical thinking? So Dr. Paul says critical thinking occurs as people recognize that thinking itself does not necessarily gravitate toward high quality. So just because you have thoughts about a topic doesn't mean that they're necessarily well informed or well researched. Rather, it often gravitates towards low quality. So when critical thinking is the systematic attempt to think about thinking in such a way as to take it apart and recognize how it's functioning, evaluate it for its strengths and weaknesses, and restructure it to make it better. In other words, it's thinking about thinking, while thinking in order to make thinking better, thinking, improving thinking, okay? So that could be a tongue twister, I'm sure, but you have to be reflective and be thoughtful about how you're developing your opinions and thoughts. And so that's one of the things that Dr. Paul thought was super important. Okay. So he goes into a lot more detail later on in the article about the stages of critical thinking. But he said that the essential traits of a critical thinker are this. He says a person with intellectual humility would know what they know and know what they don't know. I used to tell my students that all the time. You got to know what you know and know what you don't know, and that would confuse them, and I would have to explain to them that it's important to really go in depth and really know something, but to also recognize there's so much more to be learned. And so you've got to know what you know and realize you've got a lot of things left to learn. And he said that the thinker is able to fill in gaps of ignorance with knowledge rather than confuse a belief, however passionate it might be, with knowledge. All right, so that's an important trait to have. Another trait of a good critical thinker would be intellectual perseverance, ability to work through difficulties in thinking in order to solve problems that have some inherent complexity in them. And this stick-to-itiveness and this willingness to hang in there through multiple setbacks. And we'll talk more about that in the following months and during our discussions of how to motivate students. This was an idea presented by Debbie Guerrera, and it was also in the same quarterly newsletter back in 1998. It's called Wordsworth. And so she presented a concrete idea, a list of activities to help students develop their critical thinking skills. And it was interesting to note here that I think you could use this in multiple different subject areas, no matter what you teach. And so she said, get a topic that is maybe has two sides to it or multiple sides to it in your particular area, and then show students how to access data from different databases or publications. And then have students gather the data, actually do the research and gather the data. And as they're gathering it, encourage them to organize the data by points of view or other meaningful classifications. Then show all the students different model types of comparison charts. And so you're going to take this data that you've gathered and put it into charts to help you evaluate and compare the data. And then have students make their own charts out of the data that they have found. Okay, so collecting the data, putting it in these comparison charts. And then she says, have students cut and paste charts into a document or PowerPoint slides and write summaries and evaluate the validity of the arguments. All right, so just a way of organizing and then evaluating. This last step, evaluate the validity of arguments. This is where that higher order thinking skills come into view. And so let's see what else she has here as her guidelines for the activity. Okay, so she says here that you need to help the students ask the right questions. Teachers should, and this is one of the things with this higher order, is that the students might not know necessarily what questions to ask, and so you'll have to model it. And I would model it with a separate activity or a separate set of data, and not use the data that the students have gathered to model it, because they'll just come up with the same thing that you do. So you should use a different set of data and a comparison chart and look at that and critically evaluate the data, and so the students will get the right kind of ideas about what questions to ask. And she said you should emphasize the process of having students reflect on their thinking. All right, I believe that the earth is round. All right, and so how did you come up with that assumption? Did you just always know it to be true? Did you have other scientists do experiments or take pictures or gather data to support that point of view? So you need to come up with a way of critically looking. Maybe somebody makes a claim, for example, maybe they're working for a particular company that produces a product, and they're making the claim that the product helps improve your quality of life. Well, looking critically at that data, the data seems to support that, but the person has a particular point of view that they want to support because they're employed by the company. So things like that. Identify issues and conclusions, okay? Quality of the evidence, okay? So looking at, does this come from a double-blind study? Does it come from a peer-reviewed journal? Identify assumptions. Maybe there are things that the product or the point of view is assuming that you are a person within a certain age group. Will this product help them? Are you assuming that it will help people that are older or younger? What kind of data did they gather? What kind of experiments did they use? And what assumptions did they make? Identify ambiguous words like maybe is supposed to, maybe words that aren't quite as backed by a study or a set of data. Maybe they're just opinions. Identify the conclusions that the author made and look at those critically as well. Okay, so now let's look at some additional comments that she makes. She said, all these concerns help students discern between uninformed opinion and evaluation that requires them to separate analysis, text, and experience and synthesize their exploration based on these questions. This way they become true critics that uses judgment is grounded on thoughtful processes. Okay, so here she's just re-emphasizing this whole thing of thinking about your point of view, looking at the data critically, looking at the points of view of the people that are presenting the data, evaluating the strength of the data based upon, is it based upon good scientific studies, or is it just opinion? Are there any ambiguities in the data that they can identify? And so this is a cool way of looking at issues. I could see where you could do this with different presentations of different historical events, and the synthesis of those, looking at causes and effects, and looking at people's opinions about why certain things happened, and was it based on actual data or just opinion. In the sciences, you could look at different environmental studies and determine whether you think that the concerns of people are based on opinion or actual factual evidence, and so forth. So there's a lot of different cool things that you can do with this data-based type of approach and chart-based approach of comparison charts. And so I think this would be a really cool activity for you to do in your classroom. All right. So here's some other things that we brought up in the last podcast that I think might be useful when you're doing these comparisons of data. This comes from Dr. Paul again, and he has these 8 critical structures and questions. Let's just go through the critical structures, and you can refer back to the last podcast to talk about the questions. So the critical structures in thinking about looking at research or looking at opinion is, what is the purpose or goal? Now this is something that you could ask of yourself, why are you looking at this? What are you looking for? But also identify the purpose or goal of the people presenting the data. And sometimes that might uncover some bias that you need to be aware of. Not all people doing research that are funded by public companies, are biased necessarily or presenting biased data, but it's a good thing to keep in mind when you're looking at their assumptions and conclusions. What are the questions? What are the questions that you need to be asking of the data? How many people were involved in the research study, or how many years of research were conducted? Those types of things. Data, facts, and experience. Okay, so looking at multiple data points, looking at the facts that are presented, and the different experiences of those maybe gathering the data. Not all of it can be put into a nice, neat experimental formula. Some of it's just the experience of people in that period of time, especially historical events, and you can look at the experience of people from multiple points of view. Interpret data and facts, okay? So just look critically at the data and the facts involved. Substantiate claims. If just one person saw it or one person experienced it, that has less value than if multiple people experienced it or saw an event happen. What concepts or ideas can be applied? Sometimes these would be scientific concepts, but they might also be sociological type of concepts, so look at the concepts or ideas that are presented there. What assumptions are being made? Again, sometimes you can make inferences on things, and maybe they don't apply to different situations or different groups of people. What are the implications and consequences of our assumptions? What if you're wrong? what if this event did not occur the way it occurred? And think beyond just the data that's being presented and try to speculate out, what consequences this event will have over time. And some of that's highly speculative, but it's important to look at. Whether you think within a point of view. So always take your own point of view and recognize that you have one, and try not to let that bias your opinion about the facts that are being presented. So some really cool things there. I think some things that can help students think on higher levels and go beyond just memorization of dates and facts and relationships, and try to go beyond or get to that higher level of Bloom's, where they actually apply knowledge to different situations and also create new schema in terms of things that can be accomplished. All right, so this is an interesting study that I ran across. It says student choice and higher order thinking using a novel, flexible assignment regime combined with critical thinking activities to encourage the development of higher order thinking. All right, and this comes from the International Journal of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education. And so what these researchers did, and I think it was in an accounting class, what they did was they had two groups of students, and they grouped them by whether they decided to do additional type of research and study, maybe on a little bit higher thinking plane, along with their regular assignments. And so the other student, they were given a choice whether they wanted to include these additional activities, and they had a grading scale that would accommodate that and split the grades up into 4 different categories instead of just 2 categories. And so the regular instruction and the regular process of developing it was an accounting project, or they had the regular assignment and the regular project that they had to produce, with exams, and then they were also given some higher order thinking activities along with that. And so they divided the grades up, by whatever the student chose, and then they surveyed the students at the end, and then they looked at the students' performance. And so that's the general idea of this study. So they said the data showed that students came to value the flexible assignment regime by the end of the semester. That's from the surveys. These discussions indicated that students thought that the assignment options allowed them to scaffold their learning throughout the semester, reduce overall student stress, and encourage the development of higher order thinking skills. And so they feel like students would take a proactive role in their learning, combined with activities designed to develop critical thinking. These assessment strategies can be effective in developing higher order thinking skills. So those are the conclusions of the study. And then they say by offering students some of the choice, they became active participants in the assignment process, taking responsibility for their own learning. Allowing students a degree of flexibility also appears to have positive impact on their attitude and motivation towards the task. Flexibility in assignments has also been suggested to reduce student stress. And of course, they're listing some studies here to substantiate or to provide additional evidence for their claims. Okay, so to get into a little bit more detail about the exact pedagogy, I guess you would say, of the study, or how they actually conducted the study. They said the assigned tasks in the unit were divided into product-focused and process-focused activities. The product-focused tasks were compulsory for all students and allowed them to demonstrate the final product of their learning. The process-focused assignment tasks were voluntary and designed to foster higher order thinking skills as well as to assist students in their learning throughout the semester. Students could therefore choose whether or not to invest extra time and resources to complete these voluntary tasks. So they basically had two groups of students, one that just had the regular instruction and ones that had the regular instructions plus these higher order thinking tasks that they incorporated into the lessons. So this particular study, they found that 67% of the students opted for all 4 assignments and 60% exams and 40% assignment grading scheme. 33% opted for 2 values, 80% exam and 20% compulsory assignments. I guess those were the 2 choices. The effect of a flexible assessment regime on student grades, the average grade for the student who completed all 4 assessments on all 4 assessments was 63.4%, and they had that was 594 students. Students who completed only the 2 compulsory tasks had an average of 51.4%, and that there were only 281 students that completed those tasks. This represents a 12% difference in mark between choice 1 and choice 2. Okay, so let's think critically about this data. And I guess the number one thing that I thought, well, if you do more work, you're going to learn the material better. And so, and also probably the degree of investment of the students in the course would indicate students who are more invested and want to learn more would do more work. And it's just not, maybe it's just not the process of choosing the higher order thinking skills or being more involved in the educational process of choosing what you do. I think that's a very powerful thing. In fact, in the following podcast, we're going to talk about student motivation and intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And there's been a lot of work done on that. And the basic conclusion is that the more intrinsic the motivation, the wanting to improve yourself for improvement's sake, or another way of looking at it is truly enjoying the process of learning something that really interests you and that you have invested in and had some choice over, usually turns out to be a lot better than just extrinsic rewards, like for example grades, or maybe keys money. In Kentucky we have what we call keys money. Students get money for their higher education by making A's and B's. I've even had parents bribe their kids with saying, if you get an A, you get $100, a B, $80, a C, $60 or something like that. And so those would be examples of extrinsic motivation. But intrinsic motivated students tend to enjoy learning for learning's sake, and they realize this learning is improving the quality of their life. And so we'll get into that more in the following podcast. But I thought that this was an interesting approach, and one that they back up with not only their study, but other studies as well show that when students have choice, they tend to do better. And I think this one is kind of an interesting thing, and there's probably multiple reasons why the students did so much better with the additional assignments. Hey guys, sorry to interrupt, but I got an important question for you. Do you have a special skill or talent that you need to share with the world? Maybe you're an excellent photographer, or maybe you're an excellent woodworker or crafter or cook. There are any number of things that people do every day and really enjoy and do well that they need to share with others. And so let the good people at Teachable lead you through the process of designing your own online course. It's really enjoyable, plus you can make some extra money, and I've included a link down below. Maybe your special talent is commenting on videos and blogs. And so there is a place called Paid Online Writing Jobs. And I've included a post down below where you can make money per hour reviewing and writing for others. And so this is a real cool site as well. Maybe you got that back to school blues and you're dreading going out to the stores to buy school supplies for your students. And I'm going to encourage you this year to do a lot of your shopping online. One thing, you don't have to buy from depleted store shelves. You can always pick exactly what you want and find exactly what you need. And so I'll provide a Walmart link down below where you can go and shop for your school supplies. Now, when you click on an affiliate link of mine, it won't ever cost you anything extra, but I'll get a small percentage of the sale that will help me create more content for you. So hopefully you're enjoying the podcast, and we'll get right back to it. Thanks. Okay, so how did the students feel about the choice given and the assignments? It was reported in a survey that 56% of the students did not feel like their overall approach to studying changed as a result of the flexible assignment scheme. Approximately half of the students, 52.5% versus 47.8%, felt that their final grade represented their understanding of the unit. Only 23% of the students felt like the flexible system negatively affected their grade. And at the end of the assignment, 67% either reported the flexible scheme as either good or very good. So, kind of a mixed bag of results there, but that last statement that we made at the end of the assignment, 67% either reported the flexible scheme as either good or very good. And I think, if I recall correctly, that was only with the students that chose the flexible assignments. And so you still have a pretty substantial number of students there, 33% or so, that did the additional assignments that didn't feel like that it went very well for them. And maybe they were just overwhelmed by the extra work. I don't know. I'd be interested to see why that they felt like it was not a good thing. One of the things I also thought about this study was that the additional assignments probably kept the students more engaged throughout the process and less distracted. I don't know if you have experienced the same thing, but thinking back to my college days, the times that I did the best was the times that I was super busy. I was working out on the farm. I had a full load of classes. I was delivering newspapers in the dorms. And so I had to focus and get every last, the life out of every minute that I lived. I had to really budget my time well, and I did a lot better than the times that maybe I was only taking 12 hours and maybe only working a little bit here and there. I had a lot more time to kill and a lot more time to waste. And so I think that this extra regime probably helped the students think of the activities at a higher level, and it also helped them keep a lot busier as well. Okay, so another technique that you can use in your classroom to help develop the higher order thinking skills of your student is something called Neuro linguistic programming. And so sometimes they call this the Disney approach. And I think that this is a very concrete thing that you could do in designing your lessons and helping students develop these higher order thinking skills. And this comes from a study out of Sands, Malaysia. It's called effectiveness effectiveness of the Disney NLP based strategy to improve student higher order thinking skills. And so the researchers use an impact group technique to determine the sample and divide the participants into two groups, namely the control group using conventional models and the experimental group using Disney's NLP-based strategy. Instrument used are Disney's NLP strategy and a higher order thinking skills test. The instrument used to obtain the HOTS, or the higher order thinking skills data, was a subjective test in which the indicators were based on Bloom's revised taxonomy. So they had some scaffolding of their questions, and what they were looking for was the effectiveness in the teaching techniques on improving these higher order thinking skills. And so the results from the data analysis represented the effectiveness of Disney's NLP-based strategy and application of the students' higher order thinking skills. The findings of the study have shown that Disney's approach can be used as a means to facilitate college lectures in matriculation and nurturing competent students. Okay, so they concluded that the comparison between the two groups, the ones that use this neuro-linguistic programming, completed the tasks that were assigned and made better scores on their tests. So let's look at some of the particulars here, and let's talk about what this strategy entails. Okay, so the Disney's NLP strategy provides a mechanism to guide one's brain systematically. It teaches people not only to control their state and behavior, but as well as others. And so they list the study that they got this from. It's Brander, 1985. And I'll provide the links down below so you can actually go and look at in more depth at this research if you want to. In brief, it is a science of brain operation that ideally produces desired results through verbal or nonverbal communication with oneself. John Grider and Richard Brander founded NLP. They are respectively a professor and a psychologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz. They initially conducted a study on the factors that enable individuals to excel and replicate the excellence at desired levels. They observed people who are exhibiting their behavior patterns and thinking styles. And so Brander and Grider identified and validated and established a technique. So they're attributing the folks who actually came up with this Disney NLP model. Okay, so the Disney model here is a sophisticated form of thought in which Disney often used three separate modes of thinking. So the first phase is called the creative phase. Okay, so in this creative phase, this includes incorporating creative thinking to create new solutions and alternatives. I think this is kind of like the brainstorming phase. You throw out ideas and possible solutions, and you're really not worried about the scientific principles or you're not worried about silly ideas. You're really brainstorming and coming up with just being creative in the way that you approach it. You don't really think about the practicality of these ideas, but you're just trying to get lots of ideas down and do it in a creative way. So it says here, the creative phase is the process of generating ideas. In this step, there are no right or wrong principles, but ideas should be produced as much as possible because they will be revised in the following processes. And so you don't really worry about anything except coming up with lots of ideas and lots of solutions to problems. So in this phase, also your mindset is super important. You have to feel really comfortable and psychologically safe to come up with ideas. And so people should refrain from saying, oh, that's a stupid idea, or that's so silly, or you're nuts, or something like that. So you need to feel comfortable and supported in coming up with even crazy ideas. It says psychology contributes as much as 55% to help minds take action, according to Reddy and Burton. Okay, this process that proper psychology will grant the mind peace and help to generate appropriate ideas for problem solving. So there's a whole schema and a whole mindset that's involved with this first stage. Okay, so let's look at the second stage, which is called the realistic phase. And students here were required to visualize the realistic past success. So they were asked to kind of go back and look at what they were able to accomplish before and if they could accomplish the task based on their current situation. In this phase, execution procedures and means are critical. as the ideas acquired during the creative phase are in rough and vague, they will be further developed to be more practical and compatible with the current situation. In this phase, the ideas generated will be carried out while the steps are being evaluated for zero mistake effort. Disney will have animated characters to ensure the effective implementation of the ideas. In NLP, it is called the technique of the first perpetual position, which illustrates the decline in the desired situation as it occurs before the eyes. And so, as you're going through different scenarios and different ways of approaching the problem and solving the problem, you really look at each individual part and see how it either adds to the solution or subtracts from it. And so this is a very critical phase, and they call this the first perpetual position. Okay, so let's go on and look at the last phase. Okay, so the final phase, an assessment on ideas will be conducted, and they call this the second perpetual position in this NLP technique. And it's to determine the strengths or limitations of a concept or model. Hence, this approach is believed to be helpful. There is always room for improvement, permitting these phases to be reproduced to perfection, starting with the creative phase. Criticism applies exclusively to ideas of preparation, but not process. And so I think here it's just a matter of going through and looking at maybe the effectiveness of each solution and going through it again and again to see if it's the best possible avenue to solve the problem. So I think this is a technique that you can use in your classroom, and I think the whole process of brainstorming, of looking at possible solutions critically, bit by bit by bit, and then in the final analysis, maybe comparing two or more possible solutions for their effectiveness, their creativity, their total value. So I think that this would be an extremely interesting approach for students to use in the classroom and be an effective way to develop those critical thinking skills. Certainly, it comes to mind what Einstein said, that what's more important, he said, what's more important, creativity or knowledge? And he said creativity is more important, because you can always acquire more knowledge, but it's not always easy to think of things in a creative way. And so, Walt Disney, the king of creativity, certainly came up with an interesting approach here. Okay, so I was realizing that the podcast was going a little long, and so I'm going to summarize some of the data that was presented in this study, and basically they did t-test evaluation of their exams, and they looked at different factors within the exams, and they concluded from this that there was a substantial or significant difference between the students who used the Disney approach and the more traditional learning presentations. And so the data presented looked really, really good, and looked like that they had a substantial number of students involved, and their sampling techniques and their t-test evaluations were valid. So I think that this approach is a worthwhile approach to develop higher order thinking skills in your students. But I think that in conclusion here, one has to be intentional but very selective in planning these types of activities, because they're very time consuming. And so I think that these things would be good if you selected certain lessons that you really need to have students nail down certain concepts or ideas, or maybe if you're teaching English or if you're teaching history, you might be very selective on doing too much of this might deter from you getting through the material. And so we'll talk about curriculum and we'll talk about getting through the material and that sort of thing. We'll also talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation of students and ways that you can actually develop this higher order thinking and encourage intrinsic motivation. You know, that motivation where students really enjoy learning and the learning itself is more important than extrinsic things like grades. But I think you have to be careful about this higher order thinking skill stuff. But I also think that you can, within all your lessons, incorporate a certain degree of higher order questions in each one of your lessons, even though you're not doing an activity like the ones that were presented here. This culture of higher order thinking should be incorporated early, asking students in the elementary school to express their ideas and look critically at the things that they believe. I think that can be done very early on. Development of lessons should be developmentally appropriate for the students involved. And so you need to look at what they can handle and gradually scaffold activities and questioning to meet the needs of your students. And so as we go forward, we're going to talk about motivation a lot and this intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And I think that's key. You got to have some motivation. You've got to have students that want to dig deep and find solutions to problems and have those qualities of a good critical thinker. Knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know, and also having that desire to fill in the gaps with good, sound information and have students look critically at the information that they're receiving to evaluate it. Also, that level of persistence that we talked about and perseverance and not giving up and enjoying the process of tackling difficult assignments. So we'll talk all about that stuff as we go along. I hope you find these podcasts to be interesting and motivating, and hopefully you can mine some sort of activity or idea that you can use in your classroom. So thanks for your attention and looking forward to seeing you the next time.